Hi, I'm Dr. Barbara Milton. Welcome to the Social Work Show. I hope you enjoyed the last episode that I did where I basically described for you what this program is going to be all about. This is only the second episode that I'm working on. And I shared with you in the first episode about the National Association for Social Workers. That is the professional association that guides and regulates and supports and develops and trains all professional social workers in the state of New Jersey. And I also shared information about the National Association that does the same for social workers all over the country. I'm a proud member, and I explained to you the very big tent that social work embraces, all the issues, all the settings, all the clients. And I talked about all of the different roles we had, the kind of training we get, the kind of issues we're concerned about. So what I want to do in this episode is, first off, to say right up front, I'm very interested in feedback. My email is drmiltonsocialworkshow@gmail.com. And again, that's drmiltonsocialworkshow@gmail.com. And I want feedback. I would like to provide information that would be interesting. I hope I can inspire people to take action and to get involved. And really, if there's any high schooler out there or middle school child out there who says, you know what, I know I want to help. I know I want to make the world a better place. And I know that I care about my fellow human beings, my neighbors, both locally and globally. And I care about issues that impact the quality of life for people. And maybe you want to be a social worker. So I hope that this show, maybe you're not sitting down and looking at Comcast Channel 96, but maybe your parents have flipped through and they say, oh, look at this, something about social work. And they say to their child, aren't you interested in social work? And maybe they'll turn you on to the show and connect you to me, and be happy to provide guidance and support and give information about the social work profession in New Jersey. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode. What we're going to talk about today is undoing racism and how the social work profession is working hard toward healing and equality. So I'm basically going to be walking through a wonderful article that was written in the Social Work Advocates. It's the regular newsletter that is produced by the National Association of Social Workers. And again, we're talking about undoing racism, how the social work profession is working toward healing and equality. So the article starts off where Lorna Gale Woods talks about her great-great-grandfather, who can trace his ancestry back to enslavement from the West African country of Benin. And she traces it back over 159 years ago when slave traders stole Africans from the continent of Africa. It's a wonderful article written in the Smithsonian Magazine. And other Americans understand that that's the roots of Black people being in the United States of America. And in fact, um, at the Library of Congress, there happens to be a collection of slave narratives. These were stories and interviews that were done out of the Roosevelt administration in the late 1930s with a project called the Federal Writers Project. And they dispatched a number of trained agents who were mostly retired newspaper people who were actually unemployed owing to the Great Depression, because we hadn't quite come out of the Great Depression. This was a sort of a stimulus, economic stimulus package that got retired and sort of unemployed newspaper people, authors and writers, it gave them some work, you know. And they said, oh, let's do this project. And a man named Harry Hopkins was the inspiration for it, who was a social worker who had the ear of Eleanor Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt. So at any rate, these agents, these writers, were dispatched to 17 southern states. And they looked for and found um, about 1,500 Black Americans who were actually born in slavery. And they took their story down. The collection is called Born in Bondage. It's a fantastic collection. So anyway, if you want to know about that experience of living in chattel slavery, I invite you to consult that collection. Now, no one will debate that the vestiges of that chattel slavery um, is evident in contemporary society here in America. I mean, the legacy reverberates today, and the biggest way that it shows itself is in continuing racism and social inequality. Um, Now, Angelo McCain, the NASW's chief executive officer, says the reason racism persists is because those who benefit from the imbalance do not give up the benefits easily. So why is any bad behavior sustained? I mean, you know, strictly from a behavior modification approach, you know, the more it's reinforced, certainly reinforced, then the behavior continues. If the behavior is not reinforced, then you have a chance at extinguishing the behavior. But we know that what racism did is it set up a hierarchical system where one group has more power and more resources. And you know what? They don't give that up easily. Those things are built into institutions, and a lot of people don't even know this. So, you know, so we have all of this sort of stuff going on right now where, you know, you're hearing about white fragility, you're hearing about, you know, the xenophobic things that are happening with anti-immigration, with the Muslim bans, with the rise of the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan in this country. You know, we can see that this remains a constant issue that, you know, all of us have to deal with. I mean, we deal with it in interpersonal relationships, we deal with it in all the institutions that we interface with, whether it's schools or government agencies or stores we shop in or, um, uh, um, you know, churches and synagogues and mosques that we attend. All right. So one thing that is really important in social work training is this notion of cultural competence. It is sort of a foundational construct for the social work profession. And that means that all of us who work to achieve this license, we make a pledge and a commitment to get training to deal with sort of like the ways that vestiges of slavery or racism plays out in our own professional work. Biases that we hold, prejudices that we hold, narrow ways of thinking. You know, many of us don't have exposure to different kinds of people and the diversity of people that exists in this world. And so in social work, like for me, like working with like a Haitian refugee or working with immigrants or working with rural Americans that are outside of my own personal experience as a New Jerseyan, you know, as an educated woman, as a middle class woman, as a black woman, like I need to make sure that I can check my own stuff at the door so I can be of maximum help to the people that I want to uh, serve, right? That's a mandate in the social work profession to acquire social, cultural competence. Now, why is institutional racism so persistent? Well, Hillary Weaver, who's a professor and associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the State University of New York, she answers that question in the following way. She says, we're talking about institutional racism, and that's key, not personal racism, right? Institutional racism is built into the structures of our everyday lives. It's in every aspect of our communities. We're so used to this, we don't recognize its nature. We don't recognize its consequences or challenge its structures. It is so pervasive and so pernicious. So, really, it's just difficult to change what you don't see. This is why it's such a daunting challenge. Um, a lot of people say, oh, we see it so much more clearly now, and they connect it to the change in the political administration that we now have in Washington, D.C. But you have to guard against an oversimplification. Professor Weaver says, you know what, if you really take the long arc and measure, then, rather than saying, oh, we've made all these gains and now we're losing them under the current administration, which certainly, by lots of measures, could be considered as true, you have to take a longer look. You say, oh, from 1870 to now, the long arc from over the last 100 or so years, then certainly much progress has been made on the experience of moving toward progress and a more just society. I mean, obviously, there's a whole lot more work to do, but it's important to hold on to the truth that human relations have improved, that we have eliminated and reduced plenty of barriers that have like systematically held people back. So you look at those long-term trends, um, and also, um, racism. That rears its head when you think about things like, Flint, Michigan, when you think about Charlottesville, when you think about the refugee issue and the things happening on the southern border, and what some people would say has been the categorical dehumanization of the Latino community and Latinos attempting to seek asylum in this country. All of these things sort of come from the same roots in that it's sort of like otherism, it's sort of like white supremacy, it's sort of like, um, you know, vulnerable, urban, poor people are oftentimes the victims of bad policies, like we see in Flint, Michigan, right? And sort of the connection to that is like voicelessness, powerlessness, not being organized, not being present in the halls of power. And so there's sort of like, out of thought, out of mind, not in the meetings, not at the table. Decisions are made. I don't know how malicious they are per se, but certainly if no one's saying, well, hello, you're planning on building a chromium plant. Are you aware that there's like a housing project right in that neighborhood? And so tell us about like leaching, or tell us how you're going to protect our drinking water. I mean, people just haven't been at the table, which is systemic racism, right? But it all structural racism, and it's really easy to say, oh, those are the bad people, we're the good people, but it's much more complicated than that. So the most important thing to understand is that people got to get informed, and people have to take action. And in a democracy that has been framed and built um, uh, around citizen participation and citizenship, it is actually our duty to speak up, stand up, take action when we think something isn't right, whether it's related to racism and discrimination or not. Miriam Niesenbaum is a recently retired executive director of the NASW's Texas chapter. She's now an adjunct faculty member at Texas State University, and she does a lot of consulting for various companies and nonprofits. And she says we should never remain silent. We have to stand up, speak out, take action, and say that's not right. And she says, in many places we have not gotten equality, social justice, or racial and social equity because of our elected officials. If we want to have these good conversations to get to where we have equity, we have to have different elected officials. We need people who can really hear us. And we have a good chance to promote equity if we promote and elect people who support social work values. That's a fundamental change we can make. And that's what I was saying before. If you're a member of a targeted oppressed group, you tend to be voiceless, powerless, and actually that means that you aren't at the table, and you aren't able to impact the issues that you care about. And she's really saying, look, I mean, there is a component of this is about political empowerment if you want to fight for structural and institutional change. And then other people say, what we really have to do is um, uh, commit to a conscious effort to bring a change in people's attitudes as well. And that is that we need to start engaging in dialogue with people. Ask what it's like for you every day being a person of color. I think we have to do that and expand our circle. When you expand your circle and engage with people, you can intellectually understand a lot of things. Now, this is so very important because, I mean, we are fairly segregated. I mean, how far have we come? We have come far, but we do have lots of integrated communities, but we have way far many more segregated communities. And save for what people see on television, many people aren't interacting with people who aren't like them. Fear is at the root of racism. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown, right? Like rather than understanding that, our DNA as human beings, like we are all 99.99% the same from a biological point of view. It is that 0.001 that of us that may give us different skin tones and temperaments and eye color and hair color and body type, um, that makes us appear to be a different species, less than human in the way people who have a white supremacist, Eurocentric worldview or a Pan-Africanist point of view and looking at the Europeans, like, we fail to, we focus so much on that 0.001% that makes us unique and diverse rather than the fact that we are essentially, in the dark, we're all the same. You know, cut our arm, we all bleed the same red blood, right? So it comes down to we need to have connections with each other on an interpersonal basis, mano a mano, person to person, have a dialogue to cultivate empathy, to cultivate wider understanding. of the lived experience of someone who is looking different than you, who may come from a different social class than you, who may eat different foods, dress differently, have their hair different, all those sort of unique characteristics that makes an individual an individual. So what I'm saying is we have to challenge the institutional and systemic issues related to racism. And that part of what we can do is to also take action and have open dialogue with people who are uh, unlike ourselves. Sarah Krista Butts, who is a licensed social worker, director of public policy at NASW, and former executive director of the American Academy of Social Work, says that racism can indeed be difficult to address. She says, I think racism is a challenge because you're trying to undo harmful ways of thinking that have been passed on for generations. No one's born racist. I've seen plenty of memes like that on social media. Little children who are toddlers who, black and white toddlers who are hugging each other and miss each other when they don't show up for preschool. Or you've seen the ones I'm talking about, right? Racism is learned. It's a social construct. It is learned and it is passed on. Adults can model it for children, and it's passed down through generations and generations. And again, reinforced because there are benefits for maintaining the status quo. Ms. Butt says that we need more research to develop better interventions. And that's something that the NASW is certainly working on. For example, the social work profession is working to ensure that fighting racism is infused into curriculums, so students are prepared to recognize it and to take it on in their work. Um, Social workers take courses called diversity and oppression and different variations on that theme, but all about understanding people from different groups and different cultures. It is compulsory, mandated, fundamental core curriculum courses that social workers at every level take. It's infused whether you're working on your associate's degree in social services and human services, or if you're working on your BSW, your bachelor's in social work, or your master's in social work, or even a doctorate level social work. Yeah, diversity and oppression are issues under study. And the NASW is also specifically working around pieces of legislation that will codify the principles of social justice and equity and in pieces of legislation also, and hoping to get more laws on the books that break down barriers. Um, that's an essential part of it. Social work is practice at the what they call the micro level, which is one-on-one or working with families, working to alleviate suffering, to link people to the resources they need for better lives. But social work is also policy work, advocacy work, because we're not operating in a vacuum, right? I mean, there's context for our relationships, our behavior, our social transactions. And that context is largely framed by norms and laws and regulations, right? That say what our conduct should be, that are representative of values that we have and hold as a nation. So we know when it comes to undoing racism that social workers do lead on this issue. We speak up for everybody. We have a uniform voice. It's across the entire country and all the chapters in which we have members. We are providing a voice for social workers in states where policies are more challenging and make them feel supported. I mean, that's how powerful being hooked up to a national entity can be. Sometimes we're in uncomfortable positions, and we know that it's hard to manage diversity. In fact, you hear about some of these sort of weird conspiracy theories that say, because we have racism, it's a measure that diversity and democracy are at odds with one another. But it's actually quite the opposite. That if we can harness the power and strength of diversity, that it makes for democracy being realized in much more vibrant and wonderful ways. Um, so the challenge of the profession is to have the courage to label racism as racism, even though it's not that comfortable all the time. The challenge is for white members of the association to acknowledge the benefits they receive by virtue of white privilege and still challenge the structural misalignments that have developed over time because of white privilege. Partnerships can be developed with social workers of color and communities of color that can forge significant changes in society. As such, we as social workers can claim our mission to help the oppressed population and achieve social justice. Let us open our eyes and ears and engage in self-study and conversation, and then let us act. That's what social work is all about. As it so beautifully captures there, we have to open our eyes, see racism for what it is, when we see it, to, whether it's, you know, uh, you're riding down the side of a road and you see a negative encounter between a white police officer and a person of color. Like when we see the injustice, we interrupt the injustice. When we see someone being profiled, we call it out for what it is. That we're listening, using our ears, listening to one another, learning who the other is, seeing the beauty and diversity, another way to use our eyes, hearing uh, different people's opinions, having tolerance, having kindness and acceptance around our diversity. And then to engage in my part of it, self-study, like my self-awareness, understanding where my bias is, what I bring to potentially uncomfortable race interactions. And to be willing to engage in conversation with people who don't look like me, to take the courage, to take the step to engage someone else with compassion. To me, that's where sort of there's a intertwining of social work values and some of the fundamental Judeo-Christian values and spiritual values that have framed the founding of this country. And then, of course, the most important thing is to act. Take action. Take action. Interrupt. Say something. Look at pieces of legislation that foster social justice and equity. Uh, Take action. Speak up. Help to empower the marginalized. Help to work for just laws. Help to work for social justice. That's what social work is. I appreciate you tuning in again, and have a great week.